You're all very welcome back, and those of you who are here for the first session, you're also welcome. I'm not going to give a long speech, just to remind you to fill out the forms, these attendance forms that I sent around. And something I omitted on the last occasion. Yes, Roy?
We can't hear you.
Can everybody else hear me?
Yes.
Right, right. Okay. I'll put my mouth a little bit closer. All right now. Just to remind you that the exit in the event of some calamity or other is out the back where it says toilets, or out the way you came in. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to the chairman for this evening's session, who is Ron O'Donnell. Ron is a member of our committee on the Grieve School, and he's well known probably to all of you.
So welcome to this afternoon session of the Grieve School. Suffice to say, this is a very timely topic, one that's been raised in a different variant earlier today, so this is a bit of, dare I say, continuity in today's discussion. Suffice to say, this is an exceptionally educated audience, and I know half of you anyway, and the rest of you are looking forward to seeing you. So I'm very clear that I'm not going to be a heavy-handed chairman, except when it comes to the questions when I'm obliged to be a fascist, at least for 50 or 20 minutes. The reason is, with this panel, it would be an awful shame if we did not have a robust and in-depth discussion. So with no further ado, I'm just going to simply introduce very briefly our distinguished panellists. To my right, of course, to your left is Tommy McCarney. And Tommy, you've always been on the left, and you're on my right. Tommy almost needs no introduction. He's obviously a very well-known socialist Republican trade unionist. A man who's doing a very important work to unionise some of the most vulnerable workers in our society, which is a thankless task, which is why it's not reported in the media. However, I'll leave that aside for one moment. Tommy, of course, is very well known from his youthful struggle in the north of Ireland, and was a veteran of the horrendous 1980 hunger strike, which is another extremely important political episode that tends to get obscured. The reasons for that are to do with the state, is to do with factionalism, is to do with other things I wouldn't care to mention right now. But in the fullness of time, it's going to be very important that we understand how this country has evolved in all of its 32 counties. To my left is Ona Muraku, another man with long-term experience in journalism, as an author, a Gaeilgeoir. And I hope you won't mind me saying so. He's remarkable and puts the likes of me to shame for being an Irish speaker who did not have the advantages that I had as a youth by virtue of where he happened to be in the Irish diaspora. But fair dues to you. Micheál McDonagh, of course, is another Gaeilgeoir. So some of you who have the language could certainly be bilingual when you come to our questions later on. Micheál is a former editor of An Phoblacht, and currently is writing a very incisive and important commemorative series on our decade of centenaries, and he's doing short films as well. I think we need more narratives. The more narratives on this, the better, bearing in mind some of the ludicrous statements we made by people high in public society recently. Not to say that I'm biased about that. I'm involved in my own modest way in trying to do centennial style events, but I don't think I have much sympathy for those who signed the oath to solemn, believe, and confident. However, Micheál is also a senior official in Sinn Féin and a councillor. So with no further ado, I'm going to ask Tommy to lead off. The speeches are going to be in the range of 20 minutes to 30 minutes, and that should leave us plenty of time for questions.
Thank you. Okay, just make sure Roy can hear me. So thank you, Ruan. This topic, physical force and republicanism and politics, is something that recurs and recurs and recurs in Irish history. It's a question that seems to be constantly on the agenda, and one that's always worth analysing, but one that's worth analysing deeply, honestly, and with a lot of thoroughness. We begin by saying this, that when we're talking about physical force, that Republicans and republicanism is by no means the only philosophy on this island which has used or does use physical force. We're well aware of the role of Irish nationalism, the old nationalist parliamentary party, which perhaps over and above any other philosophy or political party on the island is responsible for probably more deaths in the 20th century among the Irish people than any other philosophy, with its contribution to sending tens of thousands to die in France in an imperial war. Then let's think of unionism on this island, another hefty contributor to the use of physical force. Unionism, it has been said, and with a great deal of accuracy, that it was unionism which introduced the gun at the beginning of the 20th century and used the phrase in the Solemn League and Covenant to resist Home Rule by whatever means necessary. And they were not at all ambivalent about by whatever means necessary, importing tens of thousands of weapons from Germany, forming an army, the Ulster Volunteer Force, without any qualms whatsoever to introduce violence, the use of physical force. Let's take then, after the treaty, the Free State, the new state, no qualms whatsoever in terms of its use of force to suppress opposition, ruthlessly, efficiently, and with extraordinary brutality. And the contemporary state, certainly not responsible to any extent similar to the Irish Nationalist Parliamentary Party, but not at all adverse to the use of force. No state is, and let's keep in mind that any armed body, if you arm a police officer, if you arm a soldier, nobody carries a firearm without being prepared to use it to kill. So let's get away from sanctimonious support. Carrying a firearm presupposes the willingness to use it and to use it lethally. So there's a certain, if you like, sanctimonious exceptionalism being used in that. So then let's look at something else in terms of the use of force, because as I've said, Republicans, the philosophy of republicanism is not the exclusive user of physical force on this island. Now, if we then turn round and talk about the legitimacy, about mandates, that is not an irrelevant argument, but it's a different argument, and that I'll refer to. Let's then talk about some of the hypocrisies that surround the use of force. Not often, but sometimes, there are those who rationalise their reluctance to participate. I'm not going into some form of machismo about who's willing to fight and who's not, but let's be very honest about it, that the deployment of force is either rational or not. But for those that decide to condemn the use of force because they're reluctant to pay the price, that's a rather dubious position, and many hold it. There is, on the other hand, those who have condemned Republicans who use force from a position of class contempt. Very widespread through the northern conflict. The ruffians up in Ballymurphy, the louts in Ann Street in Dungan. Certainly not the type of people you'd want to take to the Dublin Horse Show, would you? It's not a good reason. There might be some resonance in it, but it's not a good reason for taking your position against it. There is, of course, the hypocrisy of those that lionize the use of force post the conflict. We see them so often. James Connolly, how comfortable we are with him now, how reluctant we might have been to support him in 1913, 1915, 1916. Speaking recently to some friends in the National Graves Association, and they tell me of the queue of people anxious to lay a wreath on Kevin Barry's grave, and the impossibility almost to find someone willing to go to the graveside of Charlie Cairns. Yeah, there is certain hypocrisy there. There is, of course, this question about terrorism. something that's very pertinent and relevant today. Probably one of the most poorly defined, ill-defined, misused terms in the political discourse of the present day. I mean, what exactly is a terrorist? Is it someone that opposes American foreign policy? Is it someone that opposes British foreign policy? Is it someone that terrorizes? Now, how do we define, not necessarily in the Irish context, although it applies to us, but what, for example, differs the state of Israel with its massive slaughter of the people in Gaza against the resistance in Gaza? Why is it that it's said that the people in Gaza are supporting a terrorist government in terms of not only the disproportionate use of force, but also what's quite simply an illegal occupation? And taking it back to our own country, last Saturday, I read in the Irish Times Fintan O'Toole talking about a terrorist called Brendan Behan. I'm waiting to see in the run-up, Good Friday 2016, will we see the Irish Times describe Tom Clark as a terrorist. Behan was arrested in England through the 30s campaign. Quite possibly he was going to plant a bomb. But then Tom Clark was doing the same when he was arrested in England. Would it be popular to describe Tom Clark as a terrorist? Would it be possible and politically expedient for the Irish Times then to criticise Pearse for his eloquent, famous oration over the graveside of another dynamiter, O'Donovan Rossa? Probably not. We're talking here about hypocrisy and disparities. And this term of terrorism does remind me of something that Behan did say about the discrimination between what and where. Behan said that, for example, in late 1930, in 1939, the IRA wheeled a bicycle bomb into Coventry, killed a number of people, and those that were deemed responsible were executed. A few months later, the Nazi Air Force overflew Coventry, inflicted hideous damage, many more casualties, and when their flyers were captured, they were awarded the courtesy of being treated as political prisoners of war. There is that. So let's be careful when we're talking about it. There is then, of course, political self-interest in terms of the use of physical force. And this uses its muscle, it uses its propaganda machinery, it uses all the power of the state to protect the state. Something that was incredibly evident through the Northern conflict, where the Dublin regime and the Dublin regimes, time after time, instead of analysing the problem, instead of taking a position on the problem, instead of going to the heart of the problem, decided that quite simply, Dublin's priority was not to do justice, but to protect the 26 county state come hell or high water at whatever price was needed. And the simple price then was to designate the victims of the conflict and those that were struggling to break out of that siege to be the perpetrators and the cause of the problem, because it was easier to attack the Provisional IRA than to challenge unionism and the British state. It was a simple calculation, raisons d'etat. There is, of course, along with that, in terms of self-interest, those who wished simply to maintain the status quo. They're comfortable. They're well off. They don't wish to see change. So you condemn you exclude those who might bring significant change about. There is, of course, the other type of a flawed analysis of the use of physical force, that by those who we could deem to be critical friends. People who in 1969, 1970 decided that the armed option was incorrect. People who, for different reasons, frankly didn't understand the North, didn't understand the psychology of the North, didn't understand the history of the North. They didn't understand it in its broadest sense. They didn't understand it in its particular. And while they were not hostile to progress and the progressive movement, and to a large extent, had unleashed the forces that were to bring the violence about, still put separation between themselves and those who were using physical force. The northern state, and many excuses were made to draw back from that campaign of physical force. One, that it would divide the Catholic and Protestant working class. Of course it was going to do it. You can't have a civil conflict without dividing people. But throughout the history of that sad part of the island, any time there was a significant unity of Catholic and Protestant working class, the state and the forces that controlled the state, and before the state was set up, had employed sectarianism ruthlessly and effectively and efficiently to shatter unity. They did it in 1907, very simply, by sending the British cavalry onto the Falls Road to kill Catholic people and generate a fear that there was a Fenian uprising, when it was effectively, it was a working class unity and a strike. The same again in 1919, the same again in 1920, the same again in 1934, and the same again in 1939. That was the history of it, but there is another history there connected to it that has to be understood. That this didn't just come about in 1920. It just didn't come about in 1969. There was a long history, the fallout, the echoes of colonialism and imperialism. Simple and plain. There was a mentality of supremacy that had been cultivated for decades and ruthlessly enforced. Just in a personal capacity, let me just say this. My great-grandfather, never be reported, my great-grandfather married into a Protestant family, ended up inheriting a small Protestant farm, and for his trouble was kicked to death coming home from a fair. Typical, happened very often in the North, completely unreported. The other side of the family, my other great-grandfather and mother, as a result of an orange parade being attacked for attempting to march through Irish Street in Dungannon, a Catholic area in Dungannon. This was in the 1880s. Police opened fire on a crowd that were trying to prevent Orange march through the area. An Orange march through those areas invariably led to broken windows, assaults on the neighbours. It wasn't simply a matter of coming through with music. It's significant to this extent that as a result of the police opening fire, Tom Clark returned the fire in Dungannon. As a result of why Tom Clark went on the run to the States. But as a reprisal, which is underreported, never reported actually, the Orange Band marched home through a small place called Listamnet, and every house in that town land had its thatch thrown off, had its furniture smashed, had its crockery smashed, and had its animals released into the wild. Poor people suffering that. This is the psychology of what had been building up over decades. And if people were going to say then that in 69, that a response was disproportionate, was unwise, they simply had mistaken their calculation. They hadn't taken on board the reality of the situation and its inevitable impact. And one other thing for critical friends. A phrase that it's better to go down to defeat with the people than to stand apart from them in their life and death struggles. That phrase actually was used in April of 1917. Vladimir Lenin, after a failed rising by the people in April, he was forced then to go on the run. I would suggest to critical friends that it would have been better to go down to defeat the people than abandon them in their hour of need. There is, of course, in all of this, and I have concentrated on the critique, the false analysis or the flawed analysis of those that are critical. But there's also then, of course, we have to take on board the flawed analysis by Republicans. And this is incredibly important. Quite often, Republicans are confused about their objective. Too many Republicans have deemed their objective to be uniting Ireland. Now, it is an important step along the road. It may be that it's impossible to establish the Republic without uniting Ireland, and that I would certainly concur with. But as Republicans, uniting Ireland is not our primary task. Our primary task is building a republic on this island. That is the primary purpose. And the difficulty when you confuse the objective of building a republic with what may be a step along the road of simply uniting Ireland. And we have had the fixation on unity critiqued quite adequately by none other than, for example, John Taylor, Unionist MP, Lord Kilclooney. Lord Kilclooney says, of course, I'd love to see a united Ireland and it back in the United Kingdom. Well, what may be left of it after the 18th of September. A republic is the objective, and if we don't realise that, and some Republicans don't, we then start to make and draw flawed conclusions. Often we're confused about methodology, and we deem the methodology that was used in the past to justify what we're doing today as simple, what becomes a non sequitur. Along the lines, if Sean Tracy from Tipperary shot a policeman, it becomes Republicans and then today to shoot a policeman. It is a non sequitur. And too often we fall into that oversimplistic mistake. Not all Republicans, but some. And it's something that we have to contest and contend with. Because quite often Republicans, and this is a critique I think we have to take on board, that very often Republicans are not altogether familiar with the wider ramifications of the philosophy. This inadequacy may well be shared by other political parties, political philosophies, and I'm quite sure if we're talking, and republicanism is I accept it's a very broad definition, it's a broad church. But if we're talking about militant republicanism, let's take it for example that they may not have studied the works of Thomas Paine, they mightn't be familiar with the contribution, Lord help us, that Oliver Cromwell made. There's many things like that, but, and let's take it, it's not unique to Republicans. I doubt very much if every member of Fianna Fáil has read the 1937 Constitution of De Valera. I can be quite sure that nobody in the Irish Labour Party at any senior level has ever read or heard of James Connolly. So there's no point singling out Republicans for not being absolutely au fait with every aspect of the philosophy, the policy of the common good, the need for the common good, the promotion of the common good, the sovereignty of the people, recognition that the sovereignty of the people is inviolable, that we don't sell it out for financial purposes. We don't invite foreign armies to land in Shannon. All of those things, they're vitally important, sometimes overlooked when we're struggling for it. But the difficulty about it is that too often then we come round to an oversimplified conclusion that republicanism is simply about removing Britain. Just getting rid of the flag from the 6 counties, and in theatrical terms, all will then be well on the night, when it quite simply won't. It quite simply won't. And that leads, in turn, many times to the definition of republicanism as a willingness to use physical force, which is quite simply wrong. It's unfortunately a mistake that on occasions is made. But what at the same time has to be said is that there are, and there is, and remains more pertinent and relevant analysis of the use of force. There is a science behind the use of force, but there's also an imperative, an absolute imperative, that we look at force scientifically. That we don't dispense with it for any of the reasons that I have previously outlined, nor do we resort to it for any of the false reasons that I have covered. But there is a realization that we must make that echoes in some way something that was once said by Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky one time said that those that say they don't believe in physical force might as well be saying they don't believe in the forces of gravity. Physical force is there. Every state in the world has an army, has an armed police force. Physical force is an actual reality. Moreover, if we are to achieve a sovereign, independent republic, and that's obviously the politics of republicanism, and that's the philosophy, and that's what we seek to achieve, we must take on board the opposition that we will meet. Now, we may not concentrate entirely on Britain, and that mightn't even be ultimately our greatest opponent. But what we have to take on board is that the great powers, the forces, and the interests of imperialism, which reach far beyond London, will they be willing to allow us to become an independent, sovereign people? In that case, we have to look at force realistically, rationally, scientifically, and logically, and not fall into these silly cliches. The type of person who talks about, I abhor violence. My son's a member of the special branch. I was talking to him last week. He's on his way for firearms training at Tullamore, and we agreed that he would take me to the commemoration that Michael D. O'Higgins is running for the First World War. That type of bizarre hypocrisy. We have to look at it as a reality of life. It's not something we select a la carte. It's not something we select because we want to, but we have to recognize that we may have to deal with it. And deal with it whether it's popular in the press or not. And if at all possible, avoid it. Because the use of physical force inevitably involves misery. There is no other way to say it. And it's almost inevitable that those that will experience the deepest sense of misery and will suffer the most are ordinary working people. So we don't opt for it lightly, but don't step back and say that it is not a reality. Don't step back and say that it may not be put on the agenda. And if it is, let's have a very, very clear analysis of what it means, where it sits, and our relationship to it, and not fall into the comfortable cliches of the Irish Times or RTE or UTV or whatever that comfortable middle class status quo consensus of the establishment may well be, because it's there and it is all together at the end of the day. It is the midwife of change. So thanks for your attention.
James Thomas, that's very thought-provoking commentary. No doubt there'll be questions later on when we take them collectively. Our next speaker, I'm very pleased to invite, is Owen Murphy.
Agus fáilte ach go háirithe dó siúd a haisteal an seo ó Hasanna agus ó Alban atá tásúla gom le bheith nasblachas Salawad. First of all, you'll be pleased to hear that I'm going to take issue with Tommy on a great deal of what he said, which makes for a better debate. I think the issue concerning armed struggle is not one of defensively arguing against the trite rubbish that comes out from the Irish Times, from John Bruton, and from the rest of the gang who are trying to rewrite the realities of history. It is a question of what choices people should make as to how to advance a political program. Clausewitz, as we know, made the famous aphorism that war is an extension of politics by other means. And I think that's the point that I really want to emphasize. It's a question of the politics of the process which are important. If an armed struggle is a logical outpouring of the politics, for example, the Palestinian people clearly have no other means of resistance from Israeli aggression, Israeli attack, except armed resistance. It's the politics that determine what the resistance is. Now, this debate is taking place also in a context in which we have presented to us by the great and good the idea of constitutionalism. Leaving aside the issue of whose constitution, the question is put forward that a constitutional path could have achieved all these great benefits and achievements. Daniel O'Connell should be our great exemplar, not the Fenians and certainly not James Connolly. John Bruton has gone so far as to say that the whole 1916 business was an outrageous tragedy. And it is somewhat ironic that he speaks from a party which sometimes claims Michael Collins as one of its great heroes, even going so far to sort of get their dates a bit confused and propose Collins as the founder of their party. And yet nobody at any senior level in Fine Gael has come out to say, I disagree with what John Bruton has said, he's wrong, and I speak for the Collins tradition of that party. And that, I think, says something not just about Fine Gael and its claim to carry the mantle of Collins. It says a great deal about the change of the Irish middle class, the classes that rule our country, as to the way they try and find themselves and are embarrassed by the history of revolutionary struggle. A revolution that, frankly, we have to admit it, was defeated in 1921, 1922, but a revolution that has not lost its resonance amongst the Irish people. And this is why there is this constant refrain to promote constitutionalism as opposed to a revolutionary process. But that debate is not a debate about armed struggle for or against. In other words, as Tommy has pointed out, you can have a constitutional armed movement, such as the Unionist resistance to Home Rule, such as the violent legacy which John Redmond left us in the thousands who died in Flanders. You can have a peaceful republicanism, which John Mitchell looked forward to when he said, I'll take the peaceful road as soon as you give up your guns and you chain up your dogs of war. In our context, we hear people talking about what a great thing it is in Scotland that there is the possibility of independence being achieved. without a drop of blood being shed, and it is. But we as a people were not given that choice. In other words, armed struggle was forced upon us. We voted for a free and independent parliament. The British, with violence, with force, suppressed it. That is the politics of the context in which armed struggle evolved in Ireland. Now, some years ago, I met the South African communist Brian Bunting, and we were talking about this whole question. And he was describing how in South Africa, there was a major difficulty in winning people to the idea of armed struggle. Walter Sisulu, as most people know, didn't agree with the decision of Mandela and others to support armed struggle, which was proposed by the South African Communist Party. And I made the point that in Ireland, our problem is the reverse. We have to try and hold people back from armed struggle, back from getting involved too soon into a particular strategy that very often leaves the mass of the people to one side. And it is, in a document that was published during the IRA's rethink in the 1960s, there was a point made about the 56 campaign, that people had great sympathy for those who participated, but they weren't involved. And that is another point about struggle. It is a struggle of people. It is not struggle that can be carried out on behalf of people. People themselves have to be involved in the struggle, and armed struggle is only relevant or of any benefit when it flows from that itself. When I look back at my own reasons, I joined the Republican movement when I was 16 in London, 1962, Fianna Éireann. I joined the IRA in 65. Certainly I believed in taking those decisions that we as a people would need to fight Britain to drive them out of our country. But it's through the process of struggle, both within the development of the Republican movement itself in those years, that I and others came to realise that it's not a principle in itself to have an armed fight. As Monsignor Kine said in talking about the Irish language movement and comparing it to the Republican movement, he said that when many people like himself argued in the 40s for a different way of doing things, this was considered anathema, almost a betrayal. And in other words, that armed struggle became not a method to achieve something, but as a principle, as the distinguishing mark between those who were honest and loyal and those who were corrupt and on the way to selling out. And my essential point is that that is a fundamental, flawed analysis of the role of armed struggle, and it is one of the factors which has derailed much of the movement that has been put forward in our country in the last number of years. We can argue about whether it was the appropriate response in 1969. I think it wasn't, and I'll explain why in a moment. But we can also look very clearly at what the situation we're in now. And it isn't a necessity to have armed struggle because Stephen Collins writes rubbish in the Irish Times, or because John Bruton distorts disgracefully the realities of what John Redmond did to the Irish people in 1914. The issue is, what is the way in which political advance of the Irish people, to, as Tommy said, not just the reunification of the country, but to the building of a republic, a different type of society within Ireland. That is our objective, and that is what every method of struggle has to be geared towards. In other words, armed struggle is a tactic. It's not a strategy in itself, and it is certainly not a principle and not an aim. The question then is that we need a clear ideological perspective as to what freedom is, what the republic is. That it will actually be something which mobilizes the people as a whole. The original ideas put forward by Wolfe Tone were, in order to break the connection with England, the never-ending source of all our difficulties, we needed to unite our people, Catholic, Protestant and Dissenter. And in many ways, I think that is still the fundamental Republican message that we have to put out, to find the mechanisms to unite our people against something which is absolutely destructive of us. Is the future of the Protestant people only to be guaranteed and ensured by sectarianism and bigotry and by ranting and by roaring and by no and by never? Or is there a better road for the Protestant people, as indeed for the Catholic, their Catholic neighbours? And in all of that relates to the need to be clear about what it is we stand for, what a republic actually is, and of course to the class character of that republic. As James Connolly pointed out, the capitalist of his own country is a natural enemy, just as the worker of another country is his natural friend. But being a natural friend is not the same as being an actual friend. That requires political interaction, political work, and the reaching out to find accord and understanding. In my view, when we analyse the power of Britain in Ireland, of which partition is a key component, the biggest weapon that the British, or perhaps we should get used to saying the English have, the biggest weapon is in fact the Protestant community. The alienation of the Protestant community from the Republican cause, a cause which was actually in its origins shaped very much by the Protestant community, very much by those of Presbyterian outlook and Presbyterian inheritance. That alienation has allowed Britain a key weapon to divide our people and divide and rule in the old way. Now, the strategy then that I think Republicans looked for in the 60s was a strategy to, as it were, to find a means of circumventing that and create a new reality. A new reality that was based upon the democratic equality of all the people, Catholic and Protestant. A demand for, in modern day terms, parity of esteem. That the Irish language and those who speak it should have rights, clear, unequivocally respected rights. Not because it belongs to the Catholic or nationalist tradition, as Linda Irvin, who I believe is speaking tomorrow, has pointed out, it doesn't. You can be a unionist and an Irish speaker, you can be a Presbyterian and an Irish speaker, and indeed in Scotland most Gaelic speakers are Presbyterians. So the question for us is to find a mechanism whereby we neutralise Britain's power to harness a section of the Irish people against the Republic, against the building of a free, democratic, equal society for all within Ireland. And that, I believe, was the fundamental drive behind the civil rights strategy, to try and achieve that. And that is the great hope which I see from the more successful achievements of the Good Friday Agreement and the St. Andrews Agreement. Of course, there are many concessions. The idea of having, the IUC change its name to the PSNI, but within its ranks there still remain plenty of the old bigots who were there in the past. We all know that. But nevertheless, we have opportunities to reshape and reposition all of the interactions between the police force and the government, the executive, and so on. And the question we have to look at is, what is the way then that we can mobilise the mass of the people? We have struggles we have to undertake. The struggle within the trade union movement to break it away from the Labour Party's subordination to Fine Gaelism, to win a labour movement that will have an independent political line, a line that will actually put the interests of workers first, and that will also take on board the national character of the struggle of the labour movement. At the moment we have a labour movement which doesn't look to the national question at all, tries to sort of hold itself as if it's morally superior to that type of sordid battle. My argument is that we have, first of all, a battle for the heart and soul of the labour movement, north and south, but first and principally in the south. It's there that it can be won, that the connection between the Labour Party and Fine Gael can be broken. That's a key issue that must be fought for. But the other part of it is that through the struggle for democracy, we can return to the Irish people a sense of hope and expectation. It's not that civil rights is the ultimate. It's not, for example, that the Good Friday Agreement is the end result of 750 years of struggle. It isn't. It is only a stage along a process. If along that stage of process the British revert to the suppression and the violence which they used in 1918 when confronted with the vote of the Irish people, we may have no options except those of armed struggle. But the important point is an armed struggle can only be successful when it is an armed struggle of the people, not when it is the armed struggle of a small section who would like to act on behalf of the people. And this, I think, was one of the crucial problems of the provisional campaign, that you had a campaign which was carried out by a minority of the minority, because the majority of the Catholic population didn't support it at the time. That itself was obviously a minority within the six-county state, and the whole of the six counties was in itself a minority within the whole of Ireland. And one of the problems that we have was, and which the reaction uses so emphatically, and with relative success still today, is the disengagement of large masses of ordinary public opinion in the South because there were aspects of the armed struggle that they didn't like. And they didn't like them because they take a John Redmond position, or they take an arbitrary stance against the use of force by a state apparatus. They didn't like them because many of the incidents they felt, such as the La Mon hotel bombing, the T-Ban cross killings, things of this kind, they didn't gel with the people's sense of a liberation struggle. And the reason why they didn't gel was because, in a sense, the construction of that type of struggle was outside the interaction of political engagement with the people, with making demands that were achievable, that could weaken the stance of the enemy, British imperialism, and its local collaborators here in the Dublin government, and that by doing so would gradually strengthen the power and ability of people's organisations to demand changes and to have the political weight to achieve changes. So when we look in the present day situation, there are many problems. We see, for example, the two governments, as Sinn Féin has warned very consistently over the last few months, that have almost disengaged from the process. When we share in the glorification of St. Ian Paisley, we also actually should remember that the deal that was done in St. Andrews was done when Paisley was given the fundamental choice that either a deal would be done or there would be joint authority between Britain and Ireland over the north. That was a far worse prospect for Paisley than cooperating with his Sinn Féin neighbours. But it is that position of real effective threat that the unionist political expression would lose considerably. That has gone from the scene because of the positions of both governments, in a sense, not being engaged, and I suspect both governments secretly being uninterested in the issue at all. It is a crucial matter, therefore, for us here in the South to generate pressure on Flanagan, on Kenny, and God help us, on Joan Burton, to abandon the peace train and get on the path of a real struggle for peace and democracy. So my summing up, I just make the simple point. Armed struggle is only a tactic. It's not a principle. You don't cease to be a principled Republican because you think there's another way forward. You don't become a principled Republican because you keep a gun under the bed or a pike in the thatch. The issue is a political one. Do you stand and do you fight for and do you look for the unequivocal establishment of an Irish Republic that is a state in which the resources of the country belong to the people of the country together? Better together, as you might say. We should have the wealth of our country in our hands, not in the hands of German bankers, not in the hands of British imperialists, not in the hands of generals and airplane bombers. And it's not just a question that the enemy say that big bombs are good and little bombs are bad, as Brendan Behan pointed out. The point is, it is their power which we are fighting, and armed struggle may in certain circumstances be the right means to fight that power, The crucial question is to mobilise the people to actually do it and achieve a different Ireland.
Thanks all for a very eloquent and stimulating contribution. Our final speaker of the three is Micheál McDonagh.
Gurmágad Ruán agus Gurmágad Galéir, while an buíochas a gháil lescol Sarah Desmond Greaves as an cuire chun leirliv an seo agus páirte ghlach sa díospóireacht. The theme of this section, politics and the physical force tradition in Ireland, I find myself agreeing with most of what the previous two speakers said. Some of them I disagreed with. I hope I don't cover too much of the same ground, but if I do, I think I'll probably do it in a different way. The first question, what is the physical force tradition in Ireland, and is there such a thing at all? The use of the word tradition in politics is fraught with problems. We have the sloppy and often colonial and patronising description of the two traditions in the north of Ireland. We also have a probably undue reverence for all things deemed to be traditional, and we often forget at times that tradition can be bad as well as good. I prefer to speak of two traditions in a different way. Firstly, the tradition of Irish resistance to imperialism and oppression, resistance that has taken many forms, including physical force, but also unarmed struggle, political agitation, electoralism, civil disobedience, mass mobilisations, land struggles, social and economic struggles of many kinds. And secondly, the Republican tradition. This I would call a tradition based on fundamental principles and ideas set out by Wolfe Tone and the United Irishmen, by Thomas Davis, Fintan Lawler, Padraig McPearse, James Connolly, Liam Mellows, and Republican thinkers and leaders up to our own time. And to echo again what some of the previous speakers said, Irish resistance has not always been Republican in character, and Republicanism has not always necessarily manifested itself in physical force or armed struggle. Physical force has been used to a greater or lesser extent and with greater or lesser impact on our history, not because of the existence of a tradition, but because political conditions made physical force necessary or even inevitable. If you look at every phase of Irish resistance from the 1790s, you will find, I believe, that physical force was resorted to by significant numbers of people only after other methods had been met with a violent response from the British state. The United Irish Societies began by seeking a reform of the Irish Parliament and civil rights. The violent repressive response from the British state meant that the republicanism of Wolfe Tone had a receptive audience, and masses of people were prepared to rise in arms with the hope that, aided by the French Republic, Irish independence could be won. The ruthless suppression of the United Irish Revolution between 1796 and 1803 constituted a reign of terror which convinced all but a minority that armed resistance to British rule was futile. And this was even more the case after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815 and the consolidation of British naval and military supremacy. It was then the turn of mass mobilisation and constitutional agitation led by O'Connell. It took until 1829 to achieve so-called Catholic emancipation. The agitation for a repeal of the Union followed until in 1843, British guns positioned not far from where we are here were pointed across at Clontarf, where O'Connell's last Munster meeting was banned and where his career ended in a debacle. O'Connell had preached that no political objective was worth the shedding of a single drop of blood. What this meant, in effect, was that when the Great Hunger struck Ireland, it found a people disarmed and demoralised by their political and church leaders. England was free to depopulate Ireland as food was exported from a starving country, with hardly a stick or a stone lifted to prevent it. It was little wonder that the young Irelanders, those most unlikely of revolutionaries, I would say, turned to physical force. And incidentally, speaking of the young Irelanders, next month, October 2014, marks the bicentenary of the birth of Thomas Davis, which I think hasn't really been noticed. I've written a piece for An Phoblacht, but it would be it would be good to see the bicentenary marked by a rediscovery and re-examination of Davis's writings. The Irish Republican Brotherhood was in many ways a response to O'Connellite passivity and to the mass starvation, evictions and forced emigration of the late 1840s and 1850s. While the Fenians looked back to Tone and Emmet, they had to respond to the political conditions of their time. But they were hampered by their singular focus on an armed rising and their failure to develop revolutionary politics. When their armed rising proved abortive, they turned to watching and waiting and to forming the rank and file of political movements led by non-Fenians or ex-Fenians. It was the remnants of the Fenians that James Connolly had in mind when he wrote in the Workers' Republic in 1899 his essay, Physical Force in Irish Politics. Many of those involved in the 1798 centenary celebrations professed their adherence to physical force, but according to Connolly, some of them were not even Republicans. Yet they had elevated the idea of physical force to a point of principle rather than a point of strategy or tactics. And Connolly, some of Connolly's essay is worth quoting. He said, "It may be interesting then to place before our readers the socialist republican conception of the functions and uses of physical force in a popular movement. We neither exalt it into a principle nor repudiate it as something not to be thought of. Socialists believe that the question of force is of very minor importance. The really important question is of the principles on which is based a movement that may or may not need the use of force to realise its object. The use or non-use of force for the realisation of the ideas of progress always has been and always will be determined by the attitude not of the party of progress, but of the governing class opposed to that party," unquote. Had the British governing class acted differently 100 years ago in 1914, then the idea of physical force revolution in Ireland might well have remained confined to the theorising of James Connolly in Liberty Hall and the conspiring of Tom Clark in his shop in Parnell Street. The Tory sponsorship of the UVF, the Curragh Mutiny, the spawning of partition with the connivance of John Redmond, the postponement of Home Rule, and the dragging of the Irish people into the imperialist war. All of this happened in 1914, and it brought the question of physical force and the prospect of an armed uprising back to the forefront of Irish politics. The so-called revisionist argument that the 1916 Rising was planned by Pearse as a blood sacrifice has been well refuted at this stage. And of course, as other speakers have pointed out, and as I'm sure you discussed last night, the real man of blood in 1914 and 1916 was, of course, John Redmond. The Republicans decided on an armed revolt because the alternative was to acquiesce in the total submergence of the Irish people into a British Empire at war, and Ireland's emergence from that war as more of a political, cultural and economic province of Britain than ever before. They planned to succeed in 1916, but when their plans fell apart, they proceeded because an armed protest had to be made, they felt, and as a number of the leaders wrote before their executions, it would stake Ireland's claim to freedom before the world when post-war peace conferences were held. The too neat portrayal of the resumption of armed struggle and the first meeting of An Céad Dáil Éireann on the same day, the 21st of January 1919, is not accurate. The ambush at Salahead Beg was part of an IRA campaign of raids for arms rather than a concerted campaign against the Crown forces, which hadn't really begun at that stage. Yes, there were different shades of political opinion, not all of them Republican, within Sinn Féin and the Volunteers. There were different views on how far the Sinn Féin policy of establishing Dáil Éireann and an alternative government could bring them. But at that stage, they were still giving peaceful methods a chance. The British blocking of the Irish delegation to the Paris Peace Conference and their suppression of Dáil Éireann and of Republican and nationalist organisations in the autumn of 1919 ensured that the pendulum at that stage swung back to physical force and the War of Independence began in earnest. And this pattern of non-violent methods being tried first even extended to the eve of the Civil War. It is often overlooked that 6 months passed between the Dáil vote on the treaty and the opening shots of the Civil War. There were many efforts at reconciliation, but again, it was Connolly's governing class, the British Imperial government, that determined the question of peace or war when they pushed their Free State allies to bombard the forecourts. After the Civil War and the imposition of partition and the Orange State, Republicans faced 3 decades of repression, north and south. They faced defensive battles and fought defensive battles and reached near extinction in the late 1940s through imprisonment, execution and emigration. And it was in this period, I believe, between the Civil War and the Border Campaign, perhaps more than any other period, and for understandable reasons, that physical force was hardened into an inflexible tradition. This was manifested in the Border Campaign itself. As many of the leading figures later acknowledged, the political ground was not prepared, a militaristic approach dominated, and despite the courage of the volunteers, the campaign quickly petered out. In the reorientation of the Republican movement in the 1960s and in the split in 1969, the use of physical force, certainly in principle, was not eschewed by either side, least of all those led by Cathal Goulding. Despite the later protestations of so-called official Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party, Democratic Left, and the now unlamented lobotomised leadership of the Labour Party, physical force was not ditched by that group in the 60s or 70s. In fact, both sides in the split in the late 1960s were focused not on the prospect of any new armed campaign soon, but on the civil rights movement. And when that movement met with the violent response from the Orange State in 1969, they were focused on the immediate necessity of a response, both politically and in terms of physical defence. The escalation of the initially defensive physical force of the Provisionals, the reorganised IRA of 1970, into an armed campaign can only be understood in the context of the collapse of the Orange State and the direct intervention of the British Army, by then clearly on the side of the Unionist regime. As far as masses of people in the beleaguered nationalist communities of the 6 counties were concerned, their peaceful campaign for civil rights had been responded to with state violence. This was confirmed by the imposition of partition of internment without trial, in 1971, and by Bloody Sunday, which it is often forgotten that Derry March was to be the first anti-internment march by the Civil Rights Campaign in an effort to revive that movement. It is easy to see how people in the ranks of the IRA and many in wider Irish society believed in 1972 that the collapse of the Unionist one-party regime at Stormont was such a destabilising event that, with determined application of physical force, British withdrawal could follow. It was Seamus Mallon, I think, who came up with the phrase Sunningdale for slow learners. This, of course, sums up the spurious view that what was achieved in 1998 and subsequently could have been achieved in 1973. Of course, this totally discounts the fact that in 1973, internment without trial was still in force. Sinn Féin was banned in the 6 counties and had been since 1957. British Army repression on the streets was at its most intense. And with the war at its height, there was no prospect of a peace process as loyalist paramilitaries carried out sectarian killings at will. The clear aim of the British government at the time of Sunningdale, and for well over a decade afterwards, was to crush Irish republicanism, militarily defeat the IRA, and totally isolate Sinn Féin. This was their purpose in the Battle of the Prisons, when they tried to criminalise the men and women in the H blocks of Long Kesh and Armagh Jail. For many young people in Ireland at the time, myself included, that prison struggle was transformative. It demonstrated the moral force of the modern Republican cause and contextualised it in Irish history and Irish politics, from which the political establishment in this state had tried to divorce the conflict, depicting the IRA campaign as mindless violence. The mass support mobilised for the hunger strikers in 1980 and 1981 demonstrated the potential of the Republican message to make a major and lasting political impact. The widening of the struggle beyond the IRA's armed campaign was seen not only as possible but essential. When I joined Sinn Féin in 1982, the outlook was summed up in the lines of a song about the hunger strikers by the late Brian Moore. To mourn them is to organise a movement big and strong, with Armalite and ballot box, with music and with song. This strategy initially caught the British and Irish governments off guard in the early 1980s. Criminalisation had failed. Sinn Féin won key election victories in 1982. The attempt to shore up the SDLP in the New Ireland Forum in 1983 and 84 failed. The IRA almost wiped out the British cabinet in Brighton in October 1984, 30 years ago next month. But the British and Irish governments took the initiative again with the Hillsborough Agreement in 1985. Helped by the hysterical unionist reaction to Hillsborough, they were able to portray that agreement as real involvement by the Irish government in safeguarding nationalist interests. But the reality was that the Irish government had been tied in more deeply to cooperation with British policy, including the Hillsborough militarised wall along the border, political extradition, broadcasting censorship and exclusion. In the late 1980s then, the conflict settled into a period of intensification combined with total political stalemate. It was very much fuelled by ever more refined and organised collusion with loyalist counter-gangs by British Crown forces, the full extent of which is only now emerging, and as I'm sure Anne Cadwallader addressed in her earlier talk. The IRA and British forces could not defeat one another. Even retired British generals were admitting this at the end of the 1980s. In 1989, after 20 years of war, I believe people on all sides began to ask questions of themselves, even if those questions were not always and generally not articulated publicly. I know that internally within Sinn Féin, some people were questioning openly, not so much the continuation of physical force itself, but certainly the conduct of the campaign and the human and political cost of ill-conceived or botched IRA operations. And there were many such tragedies at the time, as we know. It was not easy to raise such questions because this was a movement under siege, censored, involved in a conflict, with many comrades in prison and many in their graves. Questioning of fundamental strategy could easily be seen as disloyalty, and this was a difficulty and a challenge for all sides in the conflict. The publication of Sinn Féin's document Towards a Lasting Peace in Ireland in 1992 was significant. We know now that behind the scenes, the foundations of a peace process were being laid. Gerry Adams and John Hume and others were beginning the dialogue that culminated in the public Hume-Adams Initiative of 1993. And this paved the way for the IRA cessation of August 1994, the 20th anniversary of which has just passed. I don't intend, you'll be glad to hear, to rehearse the ups and downs of the peace process and the political process since 1994. However, I will try to put it into context of our theme for this afternoon. Despite the assertions of some, and they've been referred to by earlier speakers, the conflict in all its tragedy and horror was not the product of a long-term plan by the IRA, nor was it a result of a physical force tradition. It arose out of the deep injustice of the six-county state, military repression, collusion, imprisonment, political reaction and political stalemate. That, of course, is not to say that the IRA did not have a long-term strategy designed to achieve British withdrawal and Irish unity. It did, and those are still the aims of Irish Republicans. The plain fact is, in my view, that the armed struggle had been taken as far as it could possibly go. It could have been carried on indefinitely at a certain level, but to what purpose? The point came when the IRA concluded that more would be achieved politically without physical force than could be achieved by its indefinite continuation. And of course, the human cost would continue to be horrific. It took courage to reach that conclusion and political skill to take the initiatives that made peace possible. The peace process has transformed Irish politics. Not yet as much as we would like, but transformed nonetheless. The Good Friday Agreement and the St Andrews Agreement put in place progressive political structures and a viable political process. Again, not as progressive, certainly not as progressive as we in Sinn Féin would like, and with many obstacles and many difficulties in the process, as you have heard, I'm sure, in the earlier session today. There are some who believe that the political process has failed and that we in Sinn Féin have settled for too little and blocked the path to Irish unity. I profoundly disagree with that, but I respect their point of view. Others call us sellouts and traitors. Again, they are entitled to their point of view. But those views are totally undermined, and the people of Ireland, I believe, are in fact betrayed by still others who carry out armed actions in violation of a peace process that has the backing of the vast majority of the Irish people, and in defiance of the will of the vast majority of Irish Republicans, and such groups should desist. I believe republicanism is in a stronger position now than at any time since the First Dáil. Sinn Féin is now the largest political party in Ireland in terms of votes cast on this island in the European elections and local elections in May of this year. And this is a tribute to all who have struggled for justice over the decades. Those who pursued justice and unity and freedom by whatever means were available, and for too long the only way that many saw as viable was physical force. These paved the way for a new Ireland, for a new republic. The path to that new, united, equal Ireland is open for us to take, with hard work and effort, and no less hard work and no less effort and struggle than in the past. It is a huge political achievement that to reach that goal, none of the many young people who are now politicised by Irish republicanism and by progressive politics have to face armed conflict or imprisonment or an early grave. For that, we should be eternally grateful.
Well, I think you'll agree that was rather insightful, provocative in the best sense of the word. Very sophisticated, yet civil and robust discussion, which is exactly what the Believe Summer School, school as you now call it, has always striven to achieve. There's not many places in this country or any other you'll get this type of interaction. So I'm privileged to be part of it, if only vicariously. So I would like to thank, of course, my friends and colleagues, and comrades for that matter, Micheál, Owen and Tommy, and I'll ask you to give them a round of applause.